Hello, friends. Once again, by popular demand, we are back with our good friend, Prince Fan Extraordinaire. Now, of course, I'm calling him that. He's not calling himself that. And I'm also calling him the Prince Encyclopedia. The Solitary Adventurer, welcome back again. How are you doing? And do you want to let us know where you are right now, where you're adventuring to?
Yeah, I'm great, thank you. Last time we spoke, I think I was in a cottage in Wales. This time I'm about 10 minutes south of Stonehenge.
Okay.
The famous, maybe pagan site in Britain. So I'm in the south of England.
Okay. We were just talking about how we we're both kind of taken aback at how many views there were to our last video.
Yeah, it's been an amazing response and some great comments. So yeah, very, very pleased.
Okay, of course, as soon as, things are quiet, and as soon as, of course, I'm tied up with something, my phone blows up, right? Isn't that just the way things happen to be? Okay, so we were talking last, before actually we get going, we have a couple of questions. Okay, we posted a comment. Actually, we posted some questions saying, hey, if anyone has any comments for the Solitary Adventurer. So the first one we have, the first question from Tony Delta Blues. Tony's a great guy. He's a great commenter, very valued member of our little community here that seems to be growing. He says, and this question is for you, does Prince get enough credit for the lyrical content of his songs?
I think it's unequivocally no. He absolutely doesn't. I think his first 10 years, some of the lyrics that he wrote were spellbinding. I mean, the opening line to Little Red Corvette, I guess I should have known by the way you parked your car sideways that it wouldn't last. I mean, that's, it's up there with anything that, in my mind, that Dylan or, Springsteen at his height wrote for popular music. And then, like anything in Prince's career, because it was so long, I think the way that he wrote lyrics, it maybe he didn't put as much effort in the later years. Maybe it became a little bit less personal or less artistic with some of them. But I certainly think of the 20, 30 songs that we all know and love, lyrically, they're fantastic and they should be seen that way. So I don't think he gets the credit that he fully deserved.
Now, for me, again, thank you, Tony, for that wonderful question. I'm still learning about Prince. I downloaded some of his stuff on iTunes the other day when I do my long cardio. I live out in the middle of nowhere, out in the wilderness. As you guys can probably tell, there's beavers and bears and bugs. And I like listening to his music when I go on my long walks. Our next question is from Penelope Size. Penelope Size. Now, Penelope is a relatively new but very valued commenter to our little community. And she had a great question. And her question was, I have lost her question. No, here it is. Okay. There you are, Penelope. Okay. Prince once said in a 2004 interview that all of his songs were, to him, just one song. Would you both agree? And what do you think he meant by that? Does he go along with what John Mayer said about him signing his painting? Now, I'm going to tell you, Penelope, I'm still learning, but Chris is the man to answer that question, to give his thoughts, because it ain't me.
I think it's a great question. I absolutely think that he saw the music that came from him. And you have to remember that Prince would often say in interviews, it's almost like he couldn't go to sleep because a melody might come to his mind or might pop up in his head. So I think it was a constant thing that if you sat him in an empty room, which he often did, sat himself in an empty room, he just created one song after another. And I think there were periods in his career where it just flowed out of him like a river. As one manager put it in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, it was like a tap was running and he just had to catch the water. And I think he would probably have said no one song when he was creating it had any more value than any other song. And I think after a 40-year career where you could argue Purple Rain is a very important song, When Doves Cry is a very important song, I'm sure you could start to attribute that some are, better children than others. But I think when he was creating it, that the last song he created was the greatest song he created in his mind. So I do think they were one big stream, one big picture. Yeah.
Well, Penelope, that was an absolutely fantastic question. Now, again, guys, for those of you, again, we were overwhelmed in a good way with the response to the video, the comments. I don't even remember how many comments there were, but there was lots going on. And, you know, if someone would have told me, I was telling the Solitary Adventurer earlier before we started recording that a few months ago, I made this, it's about a 30-minute video, but it's a very detailed how to change the strings on an acoustic guitar. Kind of a really detailed video. Pretty good video too, if I might say. I'm a little biased, but so what if I have two asses? And, you know, not too many views. So I was thinking, well, you know, this is a 40-minute video. We'll put it up and, you know, maybe some people like it, who knows? But we were both kind of overwhelmed at the response. It's great. And it's great to see so many people passionate about it. I often say, guys, the world has gone crazy. I don't need to get into what's been going on in the world, but at least we still have music to keep us sane. So anyway, we, with the Solitary Adventurer here, we last kind of finished up. We were talking a little bit about Paisley Park, how we funded it back in '87. I want to get back to Paisley Park. Well, I mean, physically too. I actually want to go there, but we'll get back to it as a topic a little bit later. And remember, I'm kind of assuming, but I'm thinking we might have a few of these segments to do our conversations because there's so much to cover. We literally could talk about Prince and music for days, right? But I wanted to talk about the revolution for a little bit. So what happened to the revolution, like for them to disband? That's one of the questions I had.
Yeah. So the short answer is they argued so much that Prince lost patience, and at the end of a Japanese tour, smashed a couple of guitars, came back to America and fired them at dinner about a week later. That's the short version. The long version is, the way I see it, he was giving more and more space to Wendy and Lisa, so Wendy Melvoin and Lisa Coleman, and they were rarely in a writing relationship as a trio. Mm-hmm. And he gave a lot of studio time to Wendy and Lisa to flesh out ideas, to have a go at producing records. And it seems, when I look back and try to work out where the frustration was coming from, was that he'd learned a lot from them, and musical styles. They'd opened him up to some things that, you know, maybe he'd heard or didn't really follow that route, but seeing how passionate they were about certain types of, you know, jazz and sort of the Beatles and, you know, psychedelia and that kind of stuff, it started to influence his music. But I think he had trust issues throughout his life. And if you take maybe giving a little bit of control to people, maybe feeling that, you know, can you fully trust someone who's become a big part of your life? I think at some point, all of that in conjunction just boiled over. And I think he decided, I need to get back to just being one guy in the studio and prove that maybe I don't need other people. And I am the guy who can go into a studio on his own. And that's exactly what he did. He fired everyone and went into the studio. So a lot of people might not understand this, but as a musician, as someone who's played not on the level of Prince, a regional musician, I often tell people, I've actually had friends come to me saying, I want to put a band together. What business advice? Just to have a regional band, make a few bucks, residual income kind of thing. What advice can you give me? I said, well, there's two ways to run a band. The first way is a democracy, and you're going to have a lot of headaches doing it. The second way is a dictatorship, because if it's a dictatorship, one person's running the show, they're paying everybody. And even on a regional level, most of the bands that I know that have actually made any decent amount of residual income or made a business, it was a dictatorship. When it's a democracy, it gets too messy, too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people overstating their boundaries or overstating their feelings and opinions. And the whole thing is with Prince too, is that it was his show.
like it's Prince. That's why it's his name, right? There's another famous guitar player. His name is Yngwie Malmsteen, and again, it's hopefully opening up some other guitar interest to some of the viewers out there. And he's a very famous neoclassical shredder guitar player. He's still going, influenced many people. And I remember reading some interviews with him where he would have some issues with, musicians that are, it might be over money, or they might not be getting, he's not using their musical ideas. But he's like, well, it's my name on the marquee. It's my name writing all the checks. It's my name. If you want to start contributing to all the expenses and you want to start paying 25% of this and I'll give you a 25% saying what's going on. They tended to not like that. So I'm not saying it was that way with Wendy and the rest of the group, but sometimes people get comfortable and they kind of forget about that kind of thing, right? So sometimes if you're running it as a dictatorship and you're giving people too much leeway and too much say, it can get very messy.
Yeah, I don't think Prince was ever someone who would lose track of the fact that it's his band, he's in charge.
Yes.
But I mean, you touched on money then, and I would say that money was one of the factors of several that I think was driving some animosity within the band. Was he as accurate as maybe he could have been with song credits and the input that particularly Wendy and Lisa were having at that time? No, and I think a lot of it comes from his childhood, where it was a broken home. He didn't have any money, and he'd worked hard to get the money that he had. And I don't think he'd quite come to terms with having that much wealth that maybe he could share, and he wouldn't go broke at some point down the line. So I think a young man in his 20s was just learning the lessons that we all do with money, and I think that was one of the things that Wendy and Lisa took umbrage with.
So we'll get into his movies. That's one of the topics I wanted to talk about today. You told me something very interesting about Purple Rain, and I don't think it was till after our discussion when I kind of really absorbed it and understood it. When I watch Purple Rain, it strikes me, I initially assume it's like almost like a biography of his life, right? Mm-hmm. And you had said, so you had a very good way of wording it. You said, you can't do that with the movie. You just have to take the movie for what it is. Something like that, right? Yeah. And it was very good, because I remember thinking, yeah, I was kind of taking the movie literally as this was his life. This is what was going on. But you just said a point there about Wendy and Lisa having a problem with a few things. Well, to me, one of the memorable scenes in that movie is when they're arguing with him in the dressing room about him not using their music. Yeah. So do you think there was a kernel of truth in that, or was it?
Yes, and I think it probably became more truthful after the movie with other songs. There's a big discussion about who wrote Purple Rain. It's absolutely Prince. But how do you credit someone if they wrote an embellished G major 7 to start it off with? If he wrote a GM 7 and she writes a GM sus 11 with a missing 5, and because it's like a jazz chord, how do you draw the line there and say, well, it's not fundamental to the song, but it's the thing that within 3 seconds of hearing it, everybody knows it's Purple Rain that's coming up. So I think that's always a big issue with giving credit for songs. But I think later on, there are definitely some songs where the Wendy and Lisa compositions, and maybe Prince would add lyrics to them. There's a song called Mountains that was definitely, Lisa Coleman had written, and then Prince put some lyrics on it and make some tweaks to it. And she's not fully credited for that contribution.
Yeah. When we get into this thing about Prince with money, not that I want to bring up anything negative, because there's always two sides to every story, but is there any stories of like reasonably disenchanted musicians that worked for him? Like, I can tell you, he would have been probably very demanding. He would have pushed you to be on another musical level. So there would have been a lot of good working with him. Just the prestige of having that gig saying, I'm in Prince's band. But sometimes you get people, they leave, whatever, and then they're desperate for money, and then they come out of left field with a totally BS lawsuit or claim or whatever. But was there any other stories of like reasonably disgruntled former musicians about pay or something, or?
Yeah, I mean, so we'll go back to the revolution, because I think that's certainly one where they felt they should have been paid more money, and I think they have a good case for that. But in the 90s, there was an album called Emancipation, and Prince wrote 36 songs for that album and released it as three 1-hour discs. And there were a couple of songs on there that he, paid to have the lawsuit go away, where I think the story was somebody had sent in a tape to him. He'd heard it, and then he wrote a song that was very, very similar to it. And it was settled, outside of court. Now, it's very difficult to speak with any authority, because nobody knows what the settlement was. If there was a settlement, is probably still not 100%. But I think it's always going to be a case with any musician, that where does the inspiration come from? Now, I'm kind of glad that Prince doesn't live in today's world writing mega hits, because if you look at someone like Ed Sheeran and the trouble he's goes to constantly, I mean, the guy's a pop artist. They all sound a little bit familiar, those songs, because they're all 4-chord songs. At what point does it become plagiarism, and what point does it not?
So you're bringing up a really interesting topic, and it's one that I'd like to delve into in some future videos more, is that whole concept of copyright infringement with songwriting. You'll hear some things where it's like, I don't want to get into that too much today, but the way the world is now, there's a lot of people that will, if they know you're famous or that you have money, I'm going to hit you with a fraudulent lawsuit, even though it's a complete lie, but it's putting you in the legal situation where it's cheaper for you to pay me than to fight me in court. So it's a form of legal extortion, and it's so wrong on so many levels, but it's out there and it does it. And there's a lot of lawsuits. Like, even if we look at the Led Zeppelin and Spirit lawsuit that came out, this happened, so Led Zeppelin and Spirit toured together in the late 60s, and then there came out, whether they copied or not off of the song Taurus and Stairway to Heaven, that's a whole other thing. The thing is, why did it take 40 or 50 years to come out that there was a claim? It's just, there's so many, but now, to be fair too, there is a lot of people that get ripped off with music, right? So it's kind of one of those things. But you bring something up there that's very interesting. But we also noticed, and you had told me about this quite a while ago, that later on, Prince, his personality, maybe he was getting older, he mellowed out a bit, like with the female group, Third Eye Girl. He is so amazing how he just lets other people take the spotlight. It's really so you can tell he's maybe, I don't know if in monetary funds, but he's trying to give back and help build and make other musicians and help them with their career. So it looks to me that he really, as he was getting older, he really was trying to give back in his own way. We'll get into his other philanthropy later, but that's what my observation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the research that I did around Minneapolis, you could see that I think it was 98, he started to buy some houses near Paisley Park.
Yeah.
Now, he'd always owned a couple of properties around Paisley Park, and obviously he lived near Paisley. But there were a couple of houses that he bought on a cul-de-sac, at the end of a road, that were quite private, were very close to Paisley. And over the years, the band members would all take turns living in them. So I think once he became, I almost see Prince as, there's two halves to him. There's the pre-1990 who's terrible with money. And if it costs £1 million to have an elephant at 3 a.m. in Minneapolis on a Sunday morning, he'll pay £1 million to get the elephant there.
Yeah.
And then there's the Prince who comes very close to bankruptcy in the 1990, 1991 period, where, like you say, he's got a massive entourage. It's costing a fortune to pay everyone. Yeah. Paisley's running 4 studios, if you want to count it, 24 hours a day for him to do music. And it becomes problematic because he's not selling the same number of records as he was in 1984, 85, 86.
Yeah. So we were talking about that, and with one of the things that fascinated me about Paisley Park is he bought it in 1987, and it was relatively, he had been around for a while, and you went into a detailed explanation of it in the previous video or previous discussion, that he would take that kind of financial commitment on. It was $10 million. But from a business perspective, I understand why he did that. But it seemed to me later on in his career, he was giving back to people, like the girls and Third Eye Girl. He helped make their careers. He gave them a new platform to go from. Like there's a lot of musicians that would have, that'd be nice to have it on your resume. Hey, I was in Prince's band from 2013 to 2015 or whatever.
Yeah, my thinking is that the Prince of 2004 onwards, where he almost chose to come back into the limelight. He'd never gone away for us fans because we carried on seeing him in concert.
Mm-hmm.
But he makes a conscious decision to embrace the mainstream media again. And he does some of the best publicity he's done, for 20 years at that point. And the guy who comes out the other side seems a lot more at ease with himself, a lot less combative with the world around him. He doesn't, maybe he just decides, I don't need to prove it anymore, right? The evidence is out there. I changed music in the 80s. I dominate every live setting that I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't need to just, keep thinking I'm the new kid on the block. So from that point on, the way that he structures his bands, the way that during performances he would offer up the spotlight to fellow musicians, a lot more generous than it had been in the 10 years earlier. And he had been quite generous with Wendy and Lisa. But the Prince of 2013, 14 with Third Eye Girl, he's a completely different man. He's a fully formed man this time, whereas he was a fully formed musician from 17.
Yes.
But as a man and someone with wealth, I think he struggled with how to be an adult and how to play well with others. And he sort of got a grip on that after about 2004.
Yeah, and that was great to see. And, we could talk about so much, and I'm trying to keep it kind of moving in a certain direction, but I wanted to ask you, with his work ethic, okay, so I know Prince was a vegan, I think, for most of his adult life. Was he not?
I wouldn't say it was for most of his adult life. I think there was a very defined period in the mid to late 90s where he seemed to really clean up all of his life and was living as a vegan. I think he was vegetarian, would probably be the closest for most of his life. But he had a very sweet tooth.
Yeah,
very sweet.
Don't we all? Eh? They say sugar is the cocaine of the new generation. But going back to that, I guess what kind of fascinates me being a musician, I know how hard I had to work to be, proficient on one instrument. But getting back to his work ethic, I've heard many people have told me, he slept 4 hours a night. But I'm thinking, okay, well, he became a vegan, so I'm thinking he was very conscientious of what he put in his body. But how do you work the way he did without stimulants? Like, and me now knowing I'm getting a little older, I have to be jacked up on caffeine every day to have a really productive day. Like, was he like what he I'm wondering if did he ever experiment with stimulants, or was he just a coffee or caffeine guy or monster drink guy? Like what,
Certainly from everything that we know from the engineers that worked with him, coffee was a big thing in the 80s, and he would have a pot of coffee constantly on the go.
Yeah.
And he would load the thing up till the spoon stood up in the sugar.
Yeah.
So I think that was a big thing. But I mean, half of it is youth as well, right? I mean,
this is true. This is true.
Yourself, if you step off a stage, the adrenaline is pumping so high, you couldn't sleep if you wanted to. So he just became a master at how to use the time, go into the studio, let the adrenaline wear off you while you're being creative. And then by that time, the rest of the band have slept. You've caught a nap. Now you can go and rehearse, which is even better, right? Because the rehearsal is kind of done. So you can just play songs that you want to try out, or you could try out ideas. By the time the rehearsal sound check is done, it's now time to go back out on stage. And this is a guy who he might finish a tour, but he never really stopped performing because he was paying those musicians full time. So he would just carry on back at the warehouse or Paisley Park, after he built Paisley.
This ties into two things for me: is age and sugar. So I did a cover song and a cover video for the song "Take on Me" by Aha. And I live out in the middle of nowhere, and ironically, the next door neighbor has an amazing recording studio, so he helped me mix and master it. And but he and his brother also run a maple sugar farm or maple syrup.
Yeah.
Whatever those things are. I'm Canadian. I don't even know it. And he invited me to go today. Yeah, he invited me to today. He said, "Hey, why don't you come up and see the sugar shack and all the, when I was younger, I would have been like, sugar? I would have been there. Now I'm like, I'm old. I'm like, I looked outside. I'm like, oh, it's really nasty out. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Age and sugar. It's a weird thing.
It's interesting because if I look at maybe 2008 onwards, his release schedule slows down and we stop getting one brand new album every year.
Yeah.
We start getting albums that maybe the tracks are a decade old, 5 years, and he's sort of combined them and made a bit of a compilation, which probably speaks to the lyric question that we had. Was he putting the same amount of effort in to the songs towards the end? But I certainly think he spoke about going through periods of studio rehab where he knew that, he had wives, didn't he? His first wife, certainly, he had to spend time being a family man or preparing to be a father, and the tragedy that happened with their son.
Yes.
And then the second wife, obviously, they're living in Toronto, so it's a bit more of a normal marriage, or as normal as a marriage could be for a superstar.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's times where he stepped back from the studio and recording as much because it is all encompassing.
Do you think, again, I think some people are meant to be married and I think some people aren't meant to be married. I don't know. Do you think Prince was meant to be married?
It's a big question. I would have loved for him to have been happily married.
Yeah.
And had children and, 85 years old, sitting on a stool like BB King with a great big family off to the wings, all watching him, grandkids and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I would have loved that for him, but that's just not the way his life went. And the time where he came closest to having the dream, the script, of happily married with a child, it couldn't have gone more wrong. And it was heartbreaking that, they had his first wife and he had a child. The child only lived 7 or 8 days because of some deformities that the baby had.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking in every way. And you look back and you see the kind of pain that they must have been in, but they had to put a smile on and publicize an album and things that. So the closest he ever came to being happy, I really don't understand how he got through that pain and ever got over it.
I was going to ask you, I don't think that's a pain anyone really gets over.
No, I don't think so.
Like that, and, so.
I think it certainly changed him. And maybe, as we spoke about earlier, he seems a different man a few years after that, and far more open and far more generous with other people. Maybe that's the catalyst that started all of that. We can only guess.
You hear, some people will say having children is 1/3 the life experience. I would argue, well, being able to play 16th notes at 300 beats per minute, doing sweep arpeggios is the third. But anyway, a little bit of guitar humor there for you. But I couldn't imagine that. But inherently, like the way he was constructed, like the I don't want to use the word selfish, but he, like, to do what he did, you have to be self-absorbed. You have to be your focus, like to sleep 4 hours, to be, recording any time of the day or night, to have to practice, to keep your chops up on all these different instruments, to do orchestrations with your band, to plan tours, business meetings, all that stuff. It would be hard to be married and really give someone a good effort in a marriage doing that, I think.
Yeah, and his first wife, he'd met when she was very young, and she was a dancer in the band. And I think that's about the only way that he would be able to be in a marriage, if she wasn't part of the band. Like their honeymoon was in Hawaii, and he threw concerts during the honeymoon week.
Yeah.
So there's an element, I think, where some of the creativity that he had was not forced. It was God-given, if you believe, he certainly did. And something was coming through him that was almost spiritual, and he had to create and create. Really? And then I think there were times where he hid behind the entertainment side and the performance, because it's a much nicer place to be on stage where the crowd want you to play the next song than maybe have to face up to some of the things that are going on in the real world. Yeah, so I think it's certain times I'm sure he certainly hid on stage in full view.
I don't think he would be the first famous musician to have done that either. But anyway, moving on from that. So he did a lot of, he was a philanthropist. Okay. I've had a number of people say in the comments, he was a philanthropist, but he liked to do a lot of it in private and secret. He didn't like people knowing. It's kind of like, when I hear about that, it's kind of like, when you watch a YouTube video and it shows somebody giving like a big donation to a homeless person, but they have someone secretly filming it. So it's like, they're not being completely genuine with what they're doing. And you watch it and they get like 10 million views and go like, was that really big of you to give them $50? Like, and you just got 10 million views. But anyway, but my understanding was he liked to keep things kind of private and secret with that, right?
Yes. So he had a long history of being philanthropic throughout his career.
I just want to make clear that scenario that I just told you about, that some of the people on YouTube that do that, that's not Prince. That's why he kept it secret and private. He wasn't doing it to say, hey, look at me, give me views, put money in my bank account. He wasn't doing that. It was coming from his heart in a good place. Please carry on.
Yeah. So, I'll sort of go through chronologically the ones that I know about. His manager in the early 80s, Alan Leeds, has a son who is hard of hearing or deaf. And Prince started doing a lot of pre-concert shows for deaf schools. So he would have the bass speakers placed on the floor so that the deaf children could partake in what was a full-blown concert. I mean, it was the Purple Rain tour, and he's playing, basically the whole set as a matinee for the children in the deaf school. A few years later, his fiancée at the time writes a song where she references what we now would know to be an autistic child, where it was a child who was different and had her own way of thinking in class. And that song, Starfish and Coffee, has now sort of been acknowledged as clearly the child in question would be autistic. He did a lot for autism and charitable events right up until 2014 and beyond. He did a couple of concerts, and Autism Rocks, which is a charity here in the UK, they were given the charitable contribution off the back of the gigs. But in about 2002, his mother is soon to pass, and she is very much, from a religious point of view, trying to get him to settle to one religion. And at her passing, she was Jehovah's Witness, and she begs him to become Jehovah's Witness, and he does. Part of the Jehovah's Witness way, and I'm no expert, but anonymity for charitable contributions is one of the tenets.
Well, that's admirable.
So, yes. And he hasn't been asking for any sort of praise or commendations for what he's been doing prior to that, but it goes up a level. And, a lot of the contributions are going through third parties, and they're made specifically, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to cut a check, but I do not want my name reaching out into the public domain. So the drummer for James Brown, Clyde Stubblefield, funky drummer, probably the most copied hip hop sample of all time.
Yeah.
He died, had medical bills, and then later passed from the same thing, and was basically penniless. And Prince paid the medical bills and paid for the funeral, and nobody knew until Prince passed himself. Wow. And all of these stories started to come out. So there were lots of medical bills being taken care of. In the early 2010s, Trayvon Martin was one of the young black men who was shot and killed, and
Yeah, I remember
part
that.
of the matter really has come on from those types of killings. But Trayvon Martin was wearing a hoodie, just minding his own business. And Prince said, if you see a white guy with a hoodie on, you wouldn't harm him because he might be Mark Zuckerberg. But if it's a black guy with a hoodie on, why do we think, it's not the same kind of guy or the same societal impact?
Yeah.
And because he always sort of thought out of the box and in a non-traditional way, he said, well, we need guys in hoodies, black guys in hoodies, to be tech entrepreneurs too. And then people won't, think that it's an easy target. Or so he started a Yes We Code project where young people from underprivileged areas of any race or creed would be taught tech skills. So the next Mark Zuckerberg may well come from one of those programs.
Wow.
So he was doing all sorts behind the scenes. He did an urban farming where, people grow their own food and less reliance on food banks and things. And in Oakland, in California, he put a solar panel on on the roof of each house as sort of payback for the gig that he did. So he would go into a city to do a concert, and then with the money and the expense that came off the back of the concert, the profit, he would actually filter that back into philanthropic endeavors in that area. And band members in later years would talk about, if you went to your hometown on tour, he would say, give me 3 charities in the area, and he would cut the money up from that gig and give it to the
Amazing.
charities. Amazing philanthropy. And by the time he passed, his estate was, it's been recently revalued down to like $180 million thereabouts. I kind of don't even want to think where it would have been had he not been given so much money away. And it speaks to him as a man, and him as a Minnesotan, and him as John Ellen Massey's son, that it was in his heart to be so generous with people.
Yeah.
And so generous with causes, because these are things that the legacy for these could be bigger than the music.
Yeah.
If one of those Yes We Code students comes up with the next app that makes the metaverse possible, or wherever tech, just
no, absolutely,
to a different dimension, that could be a greater contribution to society than all of his music. It's an amazing thing.
No, absolutely. So it's just, it would have been fascinating had he still been around, just to for someone to really sit down with him for 3 hours and just talk. It must have been, he's such a fascinating person. And the more I learn, including today, the more I get fascinated about him. Go, man, I've started to have a little bit of on that note, because I was going to say about my fascination with Paisley Park, the infamous round building, the egg. You had mentioned something he wanted. He was interested in making it a place where homeless people could get food.
Yeah, so it's never been quite known what his intentions were, and certainly, if he said his intentions, whether he carried them through, he might have it. On Monday this is the idea, on Tuesday it might be a complete 180. But there was talk at the time that he wanted to make some sort of a restaurant where people could come and get a free meal. Now, I've been to Minneapolis, I've been to Chanhassen, the suburb where Paisley Park is. It's about 30 miles outside of town. So if you're a homeless person on the streets of downtown Minneapolis, I don't quite know, was he planning to minibus people out, shuttle bus them? Possibly. Or maybe, it was just one of those things that would be a one-off event. But I know for a fact that he tried to get planning permission, rezoning for the building, and was denied. And then the building just basically fell into disrepair, and it, had a lock put on the doors. So it's not been well kept, and the video kind of lies to you when you see these images of Paisley Park. Okay. When you're actually up close, you can see it's quite dilapidated. It hasn't been well maintained, the round building.
Well, that's interesting.
It would be nice for them as the museum to maybe do something with that building, because it doesn't have a history. So,
Okay.
the merchandise and all of these things could well live in that building. And then you kind of keep the bits where they've commandeered to sell merchandise and put them back to their original function within Paisley Park.
It's very interesting. And again, I'm really looking forward to going to Paisley Park. I've mentioned it'd be nice to be able to meet some of the people in our little community here off of this channel. It would be great to meet some of the people and go out for, for a meal or something after and hang out and spend some time. Last topic for today. Again, I'm hoping we can do this again very soon because, it's always fascinating to talk with you. Prince's mother. I really wanted to talk to you about her last session, but, we were budgeting our time there. Prince's mother, was she musical? She must have been some form of strength in his life in his childhood. What was his relationship like with her, as he became famous, et cetera, et cetera? What's your knowledge, thoughts, recollection of all that?
So my knowledge is that she was a jazz singer and met Prince's father in one of his bands, which was actually called the Prince Rogers Trio. Was John L. Nelson's band, and he used the name Prince Rogers as a stage name, and that later became Prince's name when the baby was born. Prince's father had been married beforehand and had a child from a previous marriage. Then he meets Prince's mum, who's a jazz singer. They have 2 children, and then when they divorce, Prince's mum goes on and has another marriage and has a son there. So there's, it's quite an in-depth family tree to try and piece together, and that's why settling his estate became quite difficult. But Matty Shaw was someone who, from the outside, perhaps, the influence that she had with him sort of waxed and waned over the years. And certainly he seemed to need to prove something to his father, and perhaps didn't need to prove the same thing to his mother. I think he was looking for something from the mum, whereas he was trying to prove something to the dad. And I think that the marriage that she had that followed up is where you start to see Prince bounce from house to house, home to home. So he doesn't get along with the stepfather. He later does, but at the time where he's a teenage kid, he doesn't. He ends up moving in with the father. They end up clashing heads, and he's effectively thrown out by the dad and could end up homeless. And his high school friend, his mother is a social worker. The high school friend is Andre Simone, who plays bass in his first band and, is a key member of the early band formations and Prince's early career. But his mother really takes him in, and he is effectively adopted by her. He's allowed to live in the basement. He's got his best mate in the house, so they're constantly jamming. They're constantly moving from instrument to instrument, writing songs and, doing performances. And she has a major influence on him. And when he passed away, Prince was writing as close to an autobiography that Prince is ever going to do, somewhat mystical, somewhat cryptic. But he absolutely wanted to give a chapter to Bernadette Anderson, who is Andre Simone's mother. And she seems to be a very key figure, maternal figure for him during his teenage years. Whereas Matty Shaw isn't. From the outside looking in, it seems that she has a new family and he's had to take a little bit of a backseat because he doesn't fit into that arrangement. Everybody reconciles later in life. And, you can see his mother on in the audience of concerts, in the 80s. And so everyone sort of finds a groove, but there was a fair bit of friction. But Bernadette really comes and saves a teenage Prince and really steps up to give him that home that he needs.
I've had people in the comment section touch on that. for people, again, try and look at all things, all aspects of things when it comes to music and musicians and people that are famous. And I try to look at it from different angles, but for people really I find one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever seen about this type of thing is the dynamics of a family change once someone becomes famous, is listening to Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins on the Joe Rogan show. And it really made things weird in his family when he became famous and very wealthy. I'll let the viewers check that out. But for Prince, who became extremely successful, so his relationship with his mother, once he became really successful, you had mentioned that he had given his father a house.
Yes. Yeah. He had a house that he was building a bigger one.
Yes.
So the old house was sort of handed off to the father, and he lived there happily.
Yeah.
I can't really speak to. I know he certainly purchased the house that his mother and stepfather lived in. I found a quite strange thing when I went through the documents after he passed, and they sort of totted up his assets, and there was a small parcel of land in quite a nice suburb that somehow seems to be attributed to his mum. So I don't know whether he ever bought the land and was intending to build something for her, or whether it was a gift for her, so she had an asset, but it was just a strange finding. But I know he paid for a house, and that stayed in the Nelson family after his passing.
But as he became, obviously, no matter what, he probably would have loved his mother. But when she went on to get married again, the guy he didn't get along with, the father of her next children, obviously was the stepfather to Prince. So we know that his father, he and his father had some reconciliation later on.
Mm-hmm.
His mother, I don't know did they really, do we need to say the word reconciliation, or they still had a good relationship? Or
yes, they did.
Yeah. After he became famous, what was the relationship like with his stepfather after he became famous?
I think that the relationship with his mother and his stepfather sort of healed on the same timeline. So, I'm picking out quite a very distinct area where he's in his teenage years. And obviously once he became successful and he was able to stand on his own 2 feet financially and things like that, they healed up. Girlfriends would talk about, he would take the girlfriend on a bicycle ride to his mother's at dawn, because she was an early riser, and obviously he's in the studio at all hours. So he would take the girlfriend round. It was kind of like a seal of approval that the mother would, cook them breakfast. Yeah. So, I don't think he had it in him from a family point of view to really chop people out.
Okay.
We might not know about it, but he seemed to really value the family, and he might keep them at arm's length for business reasons. Mm-hmm. But I think, he would never see them go without. Certainly that's the opinion I have from what we've seen.
Well, this was another fascinating session. We could talk about this for probably a week on end, but I think this is our second segment. We'll wrap it up here. And again, for anybody watching this, obviously we got a lot of viewers on the first one, a lot of comments. If there's things that you would like for us to discuss, that you'd like for me to ask the solitary adventurer, or maybe perhaps go into even more detail about, please comment below, of course. And once again, I hope to catch the solitary adventurer sometime soon on his travels to have another Prince discussion for sure. So remember, folks, once again, thank you for coming on. And remember, folks, practice hard, but practice smart. And we'll see you soon.